There are several reasons why a person might be born blind. Hay varias razones por qué una persona puede ser nacido como un ciego. The most obvious possibility is physiological. There might be something physically wrong with the eye, something that prevents the eye from processing light and turning it into the kind of electrical signals that the brain needs to make seeing possible. La primera posibilidad es que hay problemas con los ojos, que los ojos no pueden procesar la luz para comunicar con el cerebro, y por eso la persona no puede ver. Or there might be something neurologically wrong. The optic nerve that connects the eye with the brain might be deformed or damaged, making the transmission of accurate visual information possible. We know something about a similar circumstance here at the church. You know, with the pipe breaks between the first floor and the fourth floor, there's no water on the fourth floor, right? You can flush the toilet all you want and nothing's going to happen. It just can't get there. The means of transmission has been broken. La segunda posibilidad es que hay problemas con los nervios y los nervios no pueden transmitir la información de los ojos al cerebro, y por eso la persona no puede ver. Or the third possibility might be that there are problems with the brain itself. There might be abnormalities in the visual cortex that receives signals from the eye and processes these signals into what we experience as sight. There may be nothing at all wrong with the eye or the optic nerve. They may be operating at full capacity, processing light and sending accurate signals to the brain, but without the brain doing its part, interpreting those signals and turning them into a visual perception of the world, the person will remain blind, forever unable to see. And we've seen that happen with a member of this congregation when Hu Ching Pan had a stroke in the right side of her brain. The right side of her brain stopped being able to process any signals coming from her left eye. And so she can't see anything on the left side of her body. The eye works fine, but she can't see out of that eye. If you cover her right eye, she can't see a thing at all, in spite of the fact that her left eye is working perfectly. La otra situación es que hay problemas con el cerebro. Si el cerebro no puede procesar la información que viene a él del ojo, la persona no puede ver. No puede ver. Porque lo que es más importante en ver es el cerebro. Es el cerebro que transforma la información del ojo en imágenes que hacen sentido a la persona. So what we know as sight is actually a complex biological process that's highly dependent on the proper functioning of many different physiological systems and subsystems. And there are a whole lot of things that can go wrong. So many, in fact, that the real miracle might be that any of us are able to see at all. And yet most of us take seeing for granted, don't we? Even those of us who have to put up with the inconveniences of corrective lenses. For most of us, seeing is absolutely fundamental. It defines how we understand ourselves in relationship to the world around us. And so we find it difficult, maybe even impossible, to conceive of what life would be like without sight, without our capacity to visualize the colors, the shapes, and the textures that make up the environment in which we live. And we find it impossible to conceive such a life until something goes wrong with our own vision, with our own ability to see. If for some reason in our lives we're forced to deal with the reality of diminished sight, or if we, God forbid, go blind. Lo que nosotros comprender cuando estamos hablando de nuestra habilidad de ver es un proceso muy complejo. Es un proceso en que muchas cosas pueden, ¿cómo se dice en español? Go wrong. ¿Cómo? Ir mal. Cosas pueden ir mal y por eso el milagro real es el milagro de la visión. Pero muchos de nosotros asumimos que la visión es normal y nosotros no podemos imaginar nuestro mundo sin nuestra habilidad de ver el mundo. Es imposible antes que nosotros experimentamos la ceguera. Of course, those who are born or become blind, they know that they cannot take seeing for granted. Whatever the cause of their blindness, they know that their inability to see places them at a tremendous disadvantage vis-a-vis the other human beings with whom they share their lives. They are frequently perceived as different, as handicapped, as incapacitated, set apart from the bulk of humanity, not by their talents and abilities, but set apart from the bulk of humanity by the differences that come from not being able to do what others unthinkingly presume to be normal. Los ciegos comprenden que ellos son diferentes, que ellos no pueden participar en la vida en la misma manera en que otras personas participan en la vida. Ellos son diferentes, ellos son incapacidades, ellos son diferentes, ellos no pueden ser parte de la sociedad en la misma manera como otras personas. Ellos no son normales. And that's the point of today's passage, isn't it? We sometimes think that Jesus is talking about real eyes, real vision process. But the problem with blindness in today's story is not really a problem of the man, is it? It's not the man's problem. The real problem in today's story is the problem of the society around him. Because they're the ones who assume that he's less than because of the fact that he's blind. They're the ones who assume that he cannot think, that he cannot hear, that he cannot speak, that he cannot live like other people. They're the ones who insist that this man has to live in the world like a person who is handicapped. And they're the ones who refuse to see this man. Maybe they're unable to see this man as a full child of God, created in the image of God. That's the problem. It's not just that the man is physically blind, it's the fact that the society of people with whom he lives are spiritually blind. And they are so spiritually blind because the connection between their eyes and their heart has been broken. The connection between their eyes and their heart has been broken. El problema en este pasaje no es la ceguera del hombre. Sí, el hombre es ciego, pero en realidad lo que es importante es que la sociedad también tiene ceguera. Ellos no pueden ver lo que Dios ha creado a este hombre para ser. Ellos no pueden ver este hombre como un hombre creado en la imagen de Dios. Ellos solamente pueden ver un ciego, un incapacitado, una persona que es pobre, una persona que no puede hacer nada de beneficio en el mundo. Y por eso la conexión entre sus ojos y sus corazones se ha rompido. Sí, es verdad. La sociedad es ciega. And the unnamed man, I mean, to the very fact that he doesn't have a name. I mean, it would be like me walking up to Catherine and pointing my finger at her and saying, "That woman." Right? That woman. Or Jose. That man. Right? that man over there. You know, I'm forgetting if her name is Catherine, or your name is Jose, or your name is Chaka. Now, how much more can we demean a human being? And yet we know from this story that these people who walked by him every single day of their lives did not know what he was called. Isn't that a tragedy? La realidad es que las personas que caminan cerca a este hombre cada día de sus vidas, ellos no saben su nombre. Es una tragedia. Porque ellos no creen que este hombre fue un hombre creado en la imagen de Dios. Él no fue importante en sus vidas. Right? He wasn't important in their lives. They didn't have to know anything about it. And so when he finally did regain his sight through this miracle that Jesus performed, you know, can you imagine this? They didn't even know he was the same man. They didn't even know if he was the same man. He must be somebody different. They didn't recognize him because one little tiny thing had changed and he was no longer the blind beggar sitting by the side of the road. Una cosa ha cambiado y él no fue más el mendiga ciega que estaba sentado al lado del camino. Es una tragedia. La sociedad, sus vecinos, sus prójimos, su familia no comprenden, no pueden ver la realidad de Dios trabajando en la vida de este hombre. And it wasn't just the neighbors. It was the disciples too. You know what the disciples said. The disciples are just downright dumb in this story. You know, los discípulos de Jesucristo son tontos. They're fools. I mean, come on. Stay with me here. You see a blind person sitting there and someone says to you, this blind man has been blind from birth. And your first response to come out of your mouth is, well, what did he do? Do you see how stupid that is? Do you think it's any more stupid today than it was 2,000 years ago? No, it was just as stupid then as it is now. But what the disciples are doing is they're walking down the street. They see this man born blind, and instead of seeing a child of God, they see a sin. Instead of seeing the child of God, they see a sin. Los discípulos, en vez de ver un niño de Dios, ellos vean un pecado. Es una tontería. Porque él ha sido ciego de su nacimiento. Y no fue posible que él podía cometer un pecado. ¿Sí? Pero ellos no pueden ver él como niño de Dios. What I'm trying to say today is that this story, which is all about blindness, is not really about the blindness that comes upon us from the loss of our eyes or from the loss of our ability to see things physically. It's the blindness that comes when we incapacitate the Spirit of God speaking to our hearts, when we refuse to listen to the Spirit of God speaking in our hearts and telling us that that person over there is important. A child of God, created in the image of God, who just happens to be homeless at this particular moment in his life. We see homelessness. Jesus sees child of God. Or we look at that person over there and we see someone who we know crossed the border illegally. And what we see is an illegal alien because we're blind. What God sees as a child of God. Or we look into our prisons, especially at those people who are forced to be in solitary confinement. And what we see is someone who's mean, someone who's cruel, someone who's bad, someone who's a sinner. And that's all we see. But Jesus, looking at the same person, sees a child of God. We look at the prostitutes on the streets. We look at people who are lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender. We look at people who are getting too old to be useful in society. We look at people who don't fit into our idea of what life ought to be and how people ought to live. People who follow different cultures or customs or religions that we do. And we fail to see what God sees. And what God sees is a child of God, created in the image of God. Lo que Dios ve es un niño de Dios creado en la imagen de Dios. No importa si esta persona es un prostituto, una prostituta, si esta persona es un drogadicto, si esta persona es un ladrón, si esta persona es una persona lesbiana, gay o bisexual o transgénero, si esta persona es un preso, si esta persona es una persona que practica otra religión o otra cultura, nosotros vemos enemigos, nosotros vemos malos, nosotros vemos pecadores, pero Dios ve algo diferente. ¿Por qué? Porque nosotros estamos buscando pecadores. Pero Dios está buscando personas que pueden ser salvados. Why is this? Because we go out looking for sinners. But God goes out looking for people who can be saved. Isn't that right? Didn't we read John 3:16 a few weeks ago? Es verdad que hace 2 o 3 semanas nosotros leímos el capítulo 3, verso 16 de Juan. And what does John 3:16 say? It says, God so loved the world. Juan dice que Dios ama al mundo. No parte del mundo, todo el mundo. Not part of the world, but all of the world. So much, God loved the world so much that God sent Jesus so that the world might be saved. Dios envió a Jesús para que el mundo pueda ser salvado. You know? We worry too much about who is good and who is bad. We worry too much about what has been. And because we worry about what has been, we worry too much about what is good and bad, we fail to see the possibilities. Nosotros nos preocupamos acerca de lo malo y de lo bueno. Y ¿por qué nosotros nos preocupamos acerca de estas cosas? Nosotros no podemos ver las posibilidades que Dios ha creado en nuestro mundo. We can't see the possibilities that God has created. But this story is about a nobody in society receiving the salvation of God. And when he receives the salvation of God, he doesn't see everything perfectly. Not by any stretch of the imagination. But what he does see are the possibilities, the hopes, the dreams. He sees those things. And isn't that what he means when he says a little bit later down in the part of the story we didn't read, when he says to Jesus, I believe. I believe in you. I believe in the child of humanity. I believe in the kingdom of heaven. I believe in the possibilities. And that's what the discipline of seeing is all about. The discipline of seeing is about going deeper, going farther in the things that present themselves immediately in front of us. The discipline of seeing is about opening our eyes to what God's dreams are, to what God's hopes are, to what God's possibilities are. And that's what this passage is all about. It's about overcoming the blindness of our hearts, the blindness of our spirits, the blindness of our souls, so that we can be part of God's salvation of our world. Este mensaje quiere hablar sobre lo que es importante para transformar el mundo, para que nosotros podamos ver el mundo en la manera en que Dios ve el mundo, para que nosotros podamos ver las posibilidades, las esperanzas, los sueños de Dios. Este es un mensaje muy importante. Esta es la disciplina de viento. Amén. Amén.